Hello chess fans, in today's video I am going to share a game where I played the Icelandic-Palme Gambit. Game 1 starts with e4. d5. E takes d5. Knight to f6. c4. e6. The pawn captures on e6, and then the bishop recaptures on e6. Knight to c3. Queen to e7. Queen to e2. Knight to c6. d3. I move my knight to d4, attacking the queen. The queen then moved to e5. I advance my knight to c2, forking the king and the rook. The king moved to d2, and I captured the rook. My opponent developed the knight to f3. Long castle. b3. I advance my knight to f4, attacking the queen. The queen then retreated to g3. I shifted my queen to b4, pinning the knight. My opponent developed the bishop to b2, attacking the knight. I captured the pawn on b3, exchanging my knight for two pawns. My opponent moved the knight back to d1. I developed my bishop to b4, delivering check. The bishop blocked the check, and we exchanged bishops. I then moved my queen to b2 to deliver check and win the knight. Knight moves back to d2. Rook h to e8. a3. In this position I missed a forced checkmate, can you find it? It's bishop to d7. If the pawn captures the knight, then the bishop moves to a4, delivering check. The only legal move is for the knight to go to b3, and then the bishop captures the knight for checkmate. Back to the game. I move my knight to e5. f4. The knight captured the pawn on d3. The bishop responded by taking the knight. The rook then captured the bishop. The queen then captured the rook. My opponent resigned. Game 2 starts with e4. d5. E takes d5. Knight to f6. c4. e6. The pawn captures on e6, and then the bishop recaptures on e6. My opponent developed the knight to f3, and I responded by bringing my knight to c6. They then developed the bishop to e7, and I moved my queen to e7. Short castle. Long castle. b3. Bishop to g4. d3. I traded my bishop for the knight. I moved my queen to e5, attacking the rook. My opponent moved the bishop to g4, delivering check. We exchanged pieces. I advanced my pawn to f5 to block the check. In response, my opponent pushed f4 to counterattack my queen. I captured the pawn on d4 with my knight. My opponent moved the queen back to d1. I then played knight to e2, delivering check and winning the queen. My opponent developed the bishop to e3. I developed my bishop to b4. My opponent pushed a3 to attack my bishop. I countered by moving my queen to b2, targeting the rook. My opponent captured my bishop, and I responded by taking the rook. Knight to d2. I moved my queen to c3, targeting both the knight and the pawns. Knight to f3. Queen takes b3. Rook to a1. a6. Knight to g5. Queen takes c4. h3. h6. Knight to f3. f4. Bishop to c1. I move my rook to d1, delivering check and attacking the bishop. My opponent resigned. Game 3 starts with e4. d5. E takes d5. Knight to f6. c4. e6. D takes e6. The bishop recaptures on e6. My opponent developed the knight to f3, and I responded by bringing my knight to c6. Knight to c3. Queen to e7. Bishop to e2. Short castle. We exchanged bishops, followed by a queen exchange. Long castle. a3. g6. Rook to d1. Bishop to g7. Rook to b1. I advance my knight to e4. My opponent pushed d3, but that pawn is pinned to the rook. Rook h to e8. My opponent developed the bishop to g5. I seized the opportunity and captured the bishop with my knight. In response, they took my knight with their own. I then captured the knight on e2 with my rook. My opponent captured the pawn on f7. I responded by moving my rook to f8. The knight retreated to g5. I captured the pawn on f2 with my rook. My opponent took the pawn on h7 with their knight. I swiftly captured the pawn on g2 with my rook. The king then retreated to f1. I delivered another check with my rook. The king moved to g1. I shifted my bishop to d4. My opponent's knight moved to g5. I followed up with another check from my rook, forcing the king to e1. With no escape left, my opponent resigned. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you can stay updated with all our latest content.